not wasting any more time, I would now request Mr. Sunil Pant to kindly give us a perception of the shape of things presently and to come as far as Afghanistan is concerned. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. And first of all, let me say what a privilege it is to be a part of such an eminent panel and to be participating in this discussion with so many knowledgeable people on board. Let me quickly get to the point. Afghanistan has had a very troubled history. If you go through it, it's supposed to be, I mean, they throw it back to about 52,000 years, which is fairly long by all reckoning. But it has always been in a state of being split, divided, reunited, conquered, reconquered, dismembered, put together, and sometimes, in a state of drift. And all that has been going on for a long time. Plus, there has been a huge amount of intervention by outside powers who have tried to dominate that particular territory in view of the fact that it has a very strong strategic location, and it is almost, if you can say, on the road, on the maritime Silk Road, which the Chinese are dreaming of, on the Silk Road of the past, which Marco Polo traversed, and it has a lot of influence going into its old connections with Tajikistan, with Uzbekistan, with the earlier Turkic cities, countries that were there. And it is a very interesting mix of ethnicities also, because of all these factors which have impacted it. In fact, the Afghan national anthem, if I remember correctly, has a reference to 14 of these ethnic groupings, and this may not be all, because there are other smaller splinter groups around which are also residing in Afghanistan and which have their own political and social features which may be slightly different from those of the others. Now, looking at all this, one needs to consider what Afghanistan is emerging into, what Afghanistan was, the potential that Afghanistan has, and how it is likely to be exploited by the powers that are around it in terms of whether they are going to take a crassly commercial self-interest view, or are they going to be more humanitarian and in terms of looking at it as a way of benefiting and supporting the Afghan people in their quest for a better life ahead. Let me also tell you, I mean, I'm sure all of you are aware that Afghanistan is possibly amongst the poorest countries in the world. And even going by their own defined poverty line, which was earlier roughly about $1, about 70 Afghanis, there were more than 48% below the poverty line. Today, with the poverty line having been raised, I think last year, notionally, to $2, which is what people feel with the rising prices and everything, is the minimum that is required for sustenance. Almost 90% of Afghanistan's population falls into the below poverty level. Now, that itself throws up very interesting issues, both sociologically and in terms of the political alignments that are happening. When you are at that kind of level of almost, you can say, basic existence, at that point, you have very little to lose. And that is what is happening. A lot of people look at what their immediate advantage is, and that is where they shift their allegiances, which is one reason why even the 5 years of the earlier Taliban rule, Taliban did get support. It was not as if it was without support. And today also, you find that there have been huge desertions. In fact, yesterday we had a board meeting and we were talking about having to close down 4 branches in various areas because of the arrival of the Taliban people in the vicinity, and it was felt that the place wasn't safe. The army and the police were non-committal about what was to be done, and therefore we felt in the best interest of the bank to safeguard the cash, move the cash, and close down the branches, because we didn't want people to be hurt in the cross-firing that could take place. Now, that is a difficult situation. Yesterday, again, late evening, I was talking to those people. We closed down our branch at Pule-Khumri. Pule-Khumri is barely about 4 hours driving time from Kabul. And you can imagine, how close these people are coming. And therefore, it is getting more and more worrisome as time goes on. In fact, there was this report that was there, which said that in the month of May, it said 30 districts had fallen to the Taliban, and another 2 in the early part of June had fallen to Taliban. So about 32 districts had fallen to Taliban in barely about 5 weeks' time. And that is again a worrying situation. The other thing is that with the Americans walking away so suddenly and without having made any backup arrangements for all their supporters, for all their contractor groups, and for all the associates that they had who were depending upon a strong American presence to continue doing things that were required to be done by them, like the police and the lower rung of the armed forces, it has become very difficult to sustain those operations, which is one reason why today we find that people are melting away. In the last episode that was there, people just melted across the Tajik border. I think that was the day before yesterday, and there were very few people left to defend the coast from the arrival of the or from the takeover by the Talibanis. So that is again something that we need to consider, that in the present situation where the country is impacted by COVID-19, which is also now taking a more virulent form, particularly in the cities where contagion is higher and higher death levels that are coming on that, with much weaker medical support facilities available. That is having taking its own toll. And at the same time, there is also the situation. Sorry. There's also this problem that is coming up in terms of the political disturbance and the military conflict that is edging closer and closer to home. In fact, today, if you want to travel between cities, you will confront at least 4 to 5 Taliban roadblocks where people are being checked. And if they are seen to be from the government service, they are being moved away. They are being taken away from their vehicles or from their mode of transport. And they are being, well, I can just say moved away. Nobody knows where they are going. So that is again something. And the Taliban has given an open offer to all the paramilitary forces, to the police and to the army, that we have no direct engagement with you. We have no direct conflict with you. If you go away, we are there to support you, and we are going to overlook whatever you may have done in the past. Now that again is an inducement, and it is taking shape. The only strong fighting force that we see is the special forces that are there, but they are overstretched. And today, with the weakening of the Air Force, which was a very strong support measure for the Afghanistan forces, as a result of the withdrawal of the Americans, the withdrawal of their contractors who were keeping the Air Force alive and going, there is likely to be some kind of a deterioration in the position. In fact, candidly speaking, I think the next 2 months are going to be critical, because it is expected that by the maybe 5th, 4th of July, most, or most, maybe entirely, the NATO and the American forces will have moved out. Now, in this context, when there is a vacuum coming up, when there is so much of turmoil, when nobody is very certain about what the future holds, and we are not very certain about what the economy holds. In fact, in the last couple of weeks, the Afghani has lost value from something like 76 to 77 Afghani to a dollar to close to 80 Afghani to a dollar yesterday. So that again is an indicator of how things are deteriorating, both in terms of the economic activity, in terms of the inflows that were supporting the dollar, and the fact that people are anticipating that with the moving away of the Americans and the NATO forces, the dollar inflow, which is very important for the Afghani economy, is going to get squeezed. It may be worth mentioning here that almost about 60% of the Afghan GDP is supported by inflows. So that is something that one has to keep in mind in case this has to be maintained. Now, come to the role of China, and after that, it will shortly very brief talk about the role of India. Or rather, I'll put it the other way. Let me talk about India first. Now, there has been some attempt by India to try and see what we can do to make sense of this situation. Let me put it very candidly, because the situation is so rapidly changing. There's so much of flux that it is difficult to be able to make any predictions or make any projections which you can validly expect to hold after maybe a few months. So it's a very, very fluid situation where people are trying to see what is the best that can be got out of it, depending upon what their interests are. India has repeatedly stated that their interest lies in an Afghan-owned and an Afghan-led process, which will be beneficial for the people of Afghanistan. These are strong words, but implementing these also requires some kind of a backup and a support. That one is not very sure whether it is available or not. And even though on the 9th of May and 9th of June and on the 15th of June, the External Affairs Minister transited through Qatar and apparently had discussions with Mr. Khalilzad. Yeah, they are sort of not publicized so much, but they say it was there. The Qatari minister said it was there. And they have tried to open a line to the Taliban factions. But again, let's look at it. Taliban is not a monolith. It's got its own factions. So apart from the Haqqani faction, which is today the strongest because of its backing from the Pakistanis, if you look at the other factions, you also have Mullah Bardar. Now, Mullah Bardar was the person who actually also signed off on this accord that was there between Taliban and the US. But he was also one of the founders of this movement. Though he was arrested by Pakistan in 2010 because he was trying to negotiate maybe a more sensible way out of the impasse that was there with the president of Afghanistan. So he was incarcerated and was released only in 2018. So 8 years he was not available, but he's back now and they're trying to work it out. The Northern Alliance, which used to be one of the mainstays of our strength, is today just a shadow of its old self, with Ahmad Shah Massoud not being there. But his son is in, and I believe Mr. Mullah Bardar is trying to support his rise in the echelons of Taliban. But it needs to be seen how much space others would concede for him to go up. The other factor also is that you have the ISIS lurking on the sidelines. Now that again is going to create its own issues because they will be people who with their Islamist agenda are going to be pushing for a certain kind of Islamic orientation in what happens now. And meanwhile, though the US have been very keen that the Taliban forsake its links with Al-Qaeda, that has not really happened. So all these are together in one box, though with their own internal differences. At this moment, they are on an upswing because of the gains that they are making in terms of the geographies and territories. Their objective seems to be to capture as much as they can before they get down to final negotiations in terms of what the composition and the shape of the government would be. Though again, in the US, in the UN declaration and the discussions that were there, it was very clearly pointed out by all parties, including Russia and China, that they would not really support an Emirates, Islamic Emirates in Afghanistan. Now, looking at the role of India, India can only play a kind of a supportive role, not a directive role, because India does not have the capacity to actually intervene in Afghanistan. We do not have a land border with them or an access point through which we can move troops and equipment to this place, to Afghanistan, and try and intervene physically. So our intervention is basically going to be in the nature of what is it that we can persuade these people. Indians are good at persuading. That's something I've seen firsthand in a lot of places. But it is not going to be easy because these people have very definite targets for themselves. The other factor also is that even though Russia and China have talked about the narcotics trade, narcotics today are in the range of about 10% of the GDP, and much of this money is being taken by the Taliban. So it is to be seen whether any of the warlords or people who control fiefdoms out there will be willing to forego this kind of a revenue as they go forward. And that is again going to be a conflict here. India can only bring in training. India can bring in support by way of services. India can bring in support by way of assisting in infrastructure development. But at this moment, these seem to be secondary objectives of the upcoming forces. At this moment, the primary focus of these forces seems to be in capturing, in holding territory, physical, tangible assets to be able to bargain. I was, as I said, discussing with the people in the bank yesterday, and what I understand is that there is a level of, I will not say demoralization yet, but there is a level of dismay at the quick withdrawal that the Americans have done, and they are feeling abandoned. So that is a feeling which can be exploited. That can be exploited now coming to the role of China. That is a feeling that could be exploited by China if it is willing to come in that measure. But I don't think the Chinese are ready for that because till some times ago, they were very happy criticizing the Americans for their continued stay in Afghanistan without really expecting them to go. They probably felt that the Americans are not going to be in a position to leave Afghanistan very soon and very easily. So they felt that they would be there. There would be a convenient whipping boy, and they could blame them for many things while they built up their own circuits and built up their own centers of influence within Afghanistan. But with the Americans suddenly walking out, one thought would be that this seems to be a very drastic kind of diplomatic initiative where they've thrown everything back at the Chinese. Now the Chinese are in a bit of a fix because even though China had made a lot of promises over the last 10 years or so, they have not fulfilled any. Look at the mining contract that they took, which was for the iron mines, less iron mines, which was supposed to be a huge revenue generator for Afghanistan. They really scratched the surface there. They complain that their people have been intimidated by the Taliban and a lot of other factors, including the lack of logistics and the lack of infrastructure holding this. But the fact remains nothing much had happened despite 10 years. They had talked about investments, but they have remained more in the nature of promises. But the Chinese have this capacity to influence top leadership. I saw that when I was handling Africa. We had opened a rep office in Luanda at the request of OAGC because we felt that with the liberation of Luanda and with the kind of goodwill that we enjoyed out there, we would be having some kind of first recourse to their oil and to their other resources. But then the Chinese just moved in, and the Chinese had the funds to pay them, and there it was. We were suddenly left high and dry. We had a rep office which we could not convert into a branch, and that was that. But the Chinese were able to take in all the oil, and that's where it was. It has happened in a lot of other places. People familiar with Africa will know that in a lot of areas where we actually had historical goodwill, we've not been able to convert that into business opportunities. Now that is something that we need to consider here also. With the Chinese are going to be as influential as they have been there. There were stories at that time of, and I'm saying that generally, with not to be quoted kind of things, that they have an overseas corporation, Chinese overseas corporation in Hong Kong, which is tasked with keeping the leaders happy. So maybe that's the way it works. Looking at it from another angle, China is also worried that in case this becomes an Islamic state and the Taliban acquires more than its share of influence and power, it is going to directly impact their problem that they have with some of their minorities. And there are ethnic connections between them. So that is something else that they are worried about. And in terms of how that could be controlled, because till about 10 years ago, you may probably remember that there were certain instances of extreme ethnic violence that took place in those regions. So that is something else that China is worried about. And therefore, China can neither leave the Afghans to themselves, nor can they take them on because it is too much of an involvement. It has too many pitfalls and it requires a very strong sense of balance and forward movement. That is one. The second is having got Iran to support them and to move in more into their camp because of the availability of funds and the fact that they are one of the probably the only country that can stand up to an extent to the United States. So to that extent, Iran is looking at China. And China has already offered them a huge amount of loan and at very concessional rates, in the sense that it is spread out over 25 years. and with repayment in energy supplies. China is looking at extending the CPEC, the BRI, through Afghanistan into Iran. And that again is something that the Chinese would be looking at. One more factor is that in case they are able to do that and firm up their tie-up, then you have got Iran on their side, Pakistan on their side. So Afghanistan is sandwiched between the two. And given the composition, the religious composition also, even though the Hazaras, who are slightly more close to the Iranians, and if you look at the Shias, who are also obviously more close to the Iranians, the fact remains that with 80% of their population being Sunni, they are able to use the Pakistan and other angles to be able to control it. The only fly in the ointment would be Saudi Arabia, because there are also interests that Saudi Arabia has in trying to prevent a complete runover of the Middle East by the Shia forces. So we are likely to see a huge amount of political turbulence, diplomatic turbulence in this area in the coming years. And it just remains to be seen which side the toast is going to fall, the buttered side or the unbuttered side. So that is something that we need to be watching. India again has its own issues because, as I said, it cannot directly intervene, yet it has a tremendous investment. We've already put in about $3 billion. We've also made a commitment to finance the Shatur Dam, which is going to supply water and resources for 22 million inhabitants of an energy-starved, water-starved city like Kabul. But there again, there will be issues with Pakistan, which is already protesting. In fact, Pakistan has repeatedly said in the last few weeks that India has a presence in Afghanistan, which is not warranted by the distance it has from the Afghan borders. So that again is a pitch that they are building on, so that in case there is a friendly government that comes in, they're able to build on this pitch and see if Indian influence in Afghanistan can be curbed. Indian influence in Afghanistan in the area of soft, what should I say, diplomacy also is to an extent waning, because I find that Turkish plays, Turkish music is today more prominent on Afghan TV channels than it was earlier. And the Indian plays, soaps and everything are getting slightly pushed into the non-competitive or the non-prominent segments. So it could be, though of course a lot of Afghans, because they've undergone training in India, they've done their studies in India, and their general experience with India has been good. They feel that India is a friendly, good country. I've been almost sometimes waved through the Kabul airport when I've been going, just because they saw my Indian passport. They said, "Delhi jate?" I said, "Delhi jate." Right. So there it goes. So I think that was also a remarkable contribution of the Indian diplomacy to the relationship that we have at that level also. But let's see how far this can be sustained in this kind of an environment. So looking at it in a nutshell, what I would say is Afghanistan is going to be the hotbed of a major struggle that comes in for control and for the purpose of finding out which side can push the envelope to what extent. The Afghans themselves are generally a set of people who are warrior-like, who are hardy people, but who have not distinguished themselves in the field of diplomacy. So one needs to see how they will take this negotiation forward. So they have been very obdurate in points, and that is also because of the fact that they come from extreme poverty backgrounds. So you have these villages that are, if you fly across Afghanistan, you see these villages perched on top of hills with barely anything around it. You don't see that kind of cultivated greenery that one would expect to see. So it is very difficult, and it's a very tough existence that they lead. Therefore, as I said, with very little to lose, they have everything to choose, and that is where all these things become options, including suicide attacks, attempts, even wars, conflicts. They become better options than continuing the way they are. So I don't know if I have any more time.
No, you don't have.
I
So
think
please conclude.
I probably used up the time. But anyways, it's an unending topic where we could discuss so many things, including the ethnic divides, including the fact that there are 4 river basins, and one of those alone actually goes into the sea through Kabul and joins up in Pakistan near Attock with the Indus River. That is again a point of contention with Pakistan because we are offering to build a dam on that. So lots of things to happen, but let me just say it is going to be a tough period for the Afghans and a period of great flux and great skills that will be required by the Indians. So thank you very much for this hearing. Thank you, sir. Thank you.